Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Few television shows have ever managed to make an entire nation laugh and grieve in the same half hour, but MASH pulled it off for 11 remarkable years. Set during the Korean War, yet filmed and written in the shadow of Vietnam, the series turned a mobile army surgical hospital into one of the richest ensembles in American television history. It won awards, broke ratings records, and closed out its run with a finale that, for decades, stood as the most-watched scripted broadcast ever aired in the United States. But longevity like that rarely comes without turbulence behind the cameras. Over its run, MASH said goodbye to several of its most beloved performers, and each exit carried its own story. Some left chasing bigger dreams that never quite materialized. Some left because a contract they never even signed gave them nothing to lose. Some left because the emotional weight of the role became too heavy to carry season after season. And at least one left simply because he felt he had told his character's whole story and had nothing left to add. This is the real story of why these actors walked away from MASH, what happened to them afterward, and how their departures ended up reshaping one of the greatest shows in television history. Before it was a television phenomenon, MASH began as a novel. In 1968, a former Korean War surgeon named H. Richard Hornberger published a semi-fictionalized account of his wartime service under the pen name Richard Hooker. The book mixed dark comedy with the grim reality of battlefield medicine, and it found an eager readership. 2 years later, director Robert Altman turned that novel into a feature film starring Donald Sutherland and Elliott Gould. Altman's version was biting, irreverent, and unmistakably a product of its era, arriving in theaters just as opposition to the Vietnam War was reaching a boiling point. Audiences responded, critics praised it, and the film walked away with major honors, including recognition at the Cannes Film Festival. CBS saw an opportunity to bring that same sensibility to the small screen on a weekly basis. Writers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds developed the television adaptation, which premiered in September of 1972. Alan Alda was cast as Hawkeye Pierce, and the show quickly became known for doing things network comedy simply hadn't done before. It leaned on authentic sound design instead of a laugh track, borrowed real combat footage to ground its more serious moments, and slowly shifted away from broad gags toward layered, character-driven storytelling. That shift didn't come without cost. As the show matured creatively, certain actors found their characters expanding while others found theirs shrinking, and that imbalance would eventually push several original cast members out the door. If you ask a longtime fan of the show to name the single most devastating moment in MASH history, there's a good chance they'll bring up the ending of the Season 3 finale. For nearly the entire episode, the story follows Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake as he receives his discharge papers and prepares an emotional farewell to the unit he commanded. It's a bittersweet, celebratory send-off, full of hugs and well wishes. Then, in its final moments, the tone shifts entirely. Radar walks into the operating room and delivers the news that Blake's plane went down over open water with no survivors. There is no score to cushion the blow, no laugh track, nothing but silence and the sound of surgical equipment. It remains one of the most talked-about scenes in sitcom history, and it marked the departure of McLean Stevenson, the actor who had played Henry Blake since the very first episode. Stevenson's version of Henry Blake was lovable precisely because he was a little overwhelmed by his own job. He wasn't sharp or commanding. He was a decent, occasionally flustered man trying to hold a chaotic unit together, and that vulnerability made him the emotional glue of the early seasons. Audiences adored him, and his performance earned him major industry recognition early in the show's run. Off-screen, though, the dynamic on set was shifting as the series went on. More and more of the narrative weight fell onto Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce, especially once Alda began contributing to writing and directing episodes himself. Stevenson reportedly felt his role shrinking in comparison, and he had ambitions of headlining a show of his own rather than playing a supporting piece of someone else's ensemble. By the end of Season 3, he informed producers he wouldn't be returning. Rather than quietly writing Henry Blake out with a routine transfer, As most sitcoms of the era would have done, the show's creative team chose to use the moment to remind viewers of the stakes of the story they were telling. War doesn't guarantee everyone a safe trip home, and Henry Blake's death drove that point home in a way nothing else on television had attempted before. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Letters poured into the network, some praising the boldness of the choice, others furious that a character audiences had grown to love had been killed off without warning. It became one of the defining moments in the show's 11-year run and one of the earliest examples of a network sitcom permanently killing off a major character. As for Stevenson himself, his career after MASH never reached the heights he had hoped for. He signed on with NBC and starred in a pair of sitcoms built around his own persona, but neither found an audience, and both were canceled quickly. In interviews years later, he expressed regret about walking away from MASH when he did, acknowledging that the ensemble, the writing, and the cultural moment he had been part of were harder to recreate than he expected. He continued to work steadily in television until his death in 1996, and colleagues remembered him warmly as a generous, good-hearted performer, even if his own ambitions had led him away from the role that ultimately defined his career. Where McLean Stevenson's exit was loud, public, and permanently etched into the show's history, Wayne Rogers left MASH almost without anyone noticing until it had already happened. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, one half of the original comedic duo that anchored the show's earliest seasons. Alongside Hawkeye, Trapper brought rebellious energy and rapid-fire banter that made the pair feel like two friends surviving an impossible situation through humor and mischief. Fans loved the chemistry, and for a while, the show genuinely felt like an ensemble built around the two of them equally. That balance didn't last. As Alda's character continued to absorb more screen time and creative influence, Trapper's arc stalled. Rogers has said in interviews that his character stopped developing and increasingly existed just to support Hawkeye's storylines rather than carry any of his own. For an actor who had signed on expecting a true ensemble show, that shift felt like a demotion he hadn't agreed to. Unlike Stevenson, Rogers didn't make a dramatic public announcement. He simply chose not to renew his involvement after season 3, and reportedly the production team didn't even realize he was gone until shortly before filming began on the next season. Adding to the strangeness of the situation, Rogers had apparently never signed a formal contract with the production, meaning there was no legal agreement for him to breach. When the studio considered legal action, it had no real footing to stand on. His departure left the writers scrambling. They handled it by simply stating in an early fourth-season episode that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be away. There was no farewell episode, no goodbye party, no emotional send-off for a character audiences had followed since day one. To fill the gap, the show introduced Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt, a steadier, more emotionally grounded counterpart to Hawkeye that many fans and critics would later argue gave the series room to grow into its more dramatic later seasons. After MASH, Rogers didn't chase another acting career the way Stevenson had. Instead, he pivoted almost entirely, building a second career as a financial investor and later becoming a recognizable voice on business television as a commentator on economic issues. His new path turned out to be enormously successful, and by all accounts, he never carried any bitterness about leaving the show behind. Alda has spoken fondly of him over the years, describing him as one of the sharpest people he ever worked with, and the two remained close until Rogers' death in 2015. Not every departure from MASH was driven by ambition or professional frustration. Some were far more personal, and Gary Berghoff's exit is the clearest example of that. Berghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the wide-eyed company clerk with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters before anyone else could hear them. Radar carried a teddy bear, spoke with a stammering innocence, and served as a kind of emotional barometer for the unit. When the world around him felt unbearable, Radar's quiet decency reminded viewers what all these characters were fighting to hold on to. Interestingly, Berghoff was the only actor to reprise a role from the original film and the television series, and he shaped Radar into something noticeably gentler and more vulnerable than his film counterpart had been. That performance became so central to the show's identity that many considered the character irreplaceable. But by the show's 7th season, the toll of the role had become difficult for Berghoff to manage. The demanding production schedule, combined with his own perfectionism, wore on him, and he has spoken candidly in later interviews about struggling with anxiety and depression during that period, issues that received far less public understanding at the time than they would today. Layered on top of that was the simple pain of being away from his family for long stretches. Berghoff was married with a young daughter during his years on the show, and he has since admitted that missing much of her early childhood was something he never stopped regretting. There are also practical disagreements. Berghoff reportedly pushed for better pay, more flexible scheduling, and reduced screen time so he could spend more time at home, and while producers made some accommodations, it ultimately wasn't enough to keep him satisfied. By season 8, he made the decision to leave. Unlike Wayne Rogers, Berghoff was given a proper farewell. His exit was built around a 2-part episode in which Radar returns from leave to find the unit falling apart without him, tries desperately to fix things the way he always had, and eventually accepts that it's time to go home to help his family's struggling farm. The episode ends with Radar walking away in near total silence, leaving his teddy bear behind on Hawkeye's bunk, a small and devastating image that captured just how much the character and the actor behind him had grown. After MASH, Berghoff largely stepped back from Hollywood. A short-lived spin-off built around his character didn't find an audience, and rather than continue chasing television work, he shifted his focus toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, eventually holding several patents, including one related to fishing equipment. He has described leaving the show as being about 2 things above all else: reconnecting with his family and recovering from burnout. Today he lives a fairly private life, rarely doing interviews, though fans occasionally catch a glimpse of him at conventions. Every great ensemble needs a foil, and for the first several seasons of MASH, that role belonged entirely to Larry Linville's Major Frank Burns. Frank was pompous, rule-obsessed, secretly involved with Major Houlihan, and thoroughly unlikable in exactly the way a good comedic antagonist should be. Audiences loved hating him, and Linville played that self-importance with precision. The problem was that Frank never really evolved. As the rest of the ensemble deepened emotionally and the show leaned further into dramatic territory, Frank remained locked into the same one-dimensional pettiness season after season. Linville, an actor capable of far more range than the role allowed him to show, began to feel the limits of the character acutely. By the end of season 5, he made the decision not to renew his contract. In his own words, he felt he had taken Frank Burns as far as the character could go. It wasn't a firing, and it wasn't a dramatic falling out. It was simply an actor recognizing that his character's usefulness to the story had run its course. His departure ended up reshaping the show in a meaningful way. Without a cartoonish villain to lean on, MASH no longer needed slapstick conflict to generate tension, and the writers were free to explore more nuanced moral territory instead. Frank was written out off-screen as having received an unglamorous administrative promotion, a quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for a character who had spent years demanding recognition. Linville continued working steadily in guest roles across television and film for the rest of his career, though he never again landed a part as widely recognized as Frank Burns. In many ways, that was true of the character rather than a reflection of Linville's talent. He had quite deliberately retired Frank at the exact moment the role had nothing left to offer. When Frank Burns exited the show, the writers didn't simply replace him with a similar antagonist. Instead, they introduced Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers, a character built almost in direct contrast to Frank. Where Frank had been petty and insecure, Winchester was cultured, arrogant, and fiercely private, a Boston aristocrat who saw himself as far above the chaos of a Korean field hospital. Stiers played the role with remarkable restraint, and over time, the character's icy exterior cracked to reveal something more complicated. Winchester wasn't cruel. He was guarded, wrestling privately with the same brutal realities of war that broke everyone else in the unit, just without ever admitting it out loud. Unlike most of the actors on this list, Stiers didn't leave partway through the run. He stayed until the series finale, closing out Winchester's arc with a quietly devastating scene in which the character teaches a group of Chinese prisoners of war to appreciate classical music, only to have them transferred away before he can finish the lesson. It's one of the more understated moments in the finale, and it captured everything Winchester had become over the years, a man who had learned, in his own reserved way, to care deeply about people he once would have dismissed entirely. When offered a role in the short-lived spin-off that followed MASH, Stiers declined, feeling that Winchester's story had already reached its natural conclusion. He went on to a long and varied career, most notably lending his voice to a string of well-known animated films. Later in life, he spoke publicly about his sexuality, explaining that he had kept that part of his life private for much of his career out of concern that it could limit his opportunities in the industry. A very real fear for performers of his generation working in mainstream film and voice acting. He passed away in 2018, remembered as much for the quiet dignity of his personal life as for the depth he brought to one of television's most memorable supporting characters. Amid all these departures, one performer's story stands out precisely because she never left at all. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan for the entire 11-season run, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the pilot and the series finale. Margaret began the show as little more than a punchline, her nickname alone reducing her to a joke inherited from the original film. She was strict, rigid, and largely there to be laughed at rather than understood. Swit pushed back against that limitation season after season, gradually reshaping Margaret into a fully realized character with her own intelligence, authority, and vulnerability. By the end of the series, Margaret had become a decorated officer and a skilled head nurse who openly questioned the morality of the war around her, all while continuing to do her job with total precision. While the men around her came and went, sometimes dramatically, sometimes quietly, Swit's steady presence gave the show a kind of continuity the other characters couldn't provide. Her insistence on giving Margaret real depth is often credited as one of the reasons the show's female characters were ultimately taken far more seriously than similar roles on other sitcoms of the era. Looking back across all of these exits, a pattern starts to emerge. MASH was never a show built around a single star, and that ensemble structure meant that as certain characters grew, in Alda's case, both in front of and behind the camera, others inevitably shrank in comparison. For some actors, that shift felt like an opportunity to move on to something bigger. For others, it felt like being pushed out of the story they had helped build from the beginning. What's remarkable is how differently the show handled each departure. Some characters were killed off in moments that reshaped television history. Others vanished with barely an explanation. Some were given full farewell episodes built around genuine emotional closure, while others were quietly written off as having received an unremarkable promotion somewhere off-screen. That inconsistency wasn't a flaw, so much as a reflection of how the show itself was evolving in real time, adjusting its tone and its cast in response to what the story needed at any given moment. Despite all that turnover, MASH never lost its identity. If anything, each departure forced the series to reinvent itself slightly, trading broad comedic dynamics for deeper emotional storytelling as the years went on. The introduction of B.J. Honeycutt in place of Trapper John, and later Winchester in place of Frank Burns, didn't weaken the show. In the eyes of many longtime fans, it strengthened it, pushing the series away from its more juvenile early instincts and toward the more layered, bittersweet tone that ultimately defined its legacy. 11 seasons is a long time for any show to stay relevant, let alone to remain one of the most respected series in television history. Part of what made that longevity possible was the willingness of its creative team to let characters go when a story genuinely called for it, rather than clinging to a fixed cast out of habit. Stevenson left chasing stardom that never quite arrived and later admitted he regretted the choice. Wayne Rogers walked away, quietly over a contract that technically didn't even exist, and built an entirely new career far from Hollywood. Gary Berghoff left to save his own well-being and reconnect with the family he had been missing. Larry Linville stepped away once he felt his character had nothing left to give. David Ogden Stiers stayed until the very end, closing out his character's arc on his own terms. And Loretta Swit never left at all, using her staying power to